Hello and welcome to another episode of Brand Retro. Today on the podcast we have Michael Christopher Brown. Michael, how are you?
Very good. Thank you.
Yeah, so welcome to the podcast. And I was giving you a little bit of a breakdown of how I wanted to steer this conversation. And this is in some ways different but the same, different than a lot of different topics that we have. And one of the things I want to talk about is, and we can jump into specific instances of, but what you do with photography, I'll let you kind of break down kind of your version of it. But how I kind of see it is, man, you're a storyteller. Obviously, you're a photographer, and you are really capturing the human element behind your craft. And I'm curious, kind of what your thoughts are, what your perspective is on all that, and kind of how you've crafted your career around this, because it's really outstanding, the body of work that you have behind you and just kind of the different things that you've been involved in.
Right on. Thank you, Mike. Yeah. Yeah. It's been incredible. I mean, I've been super lucky and I feel very privileged to have seen a lot of the world and made a living from this. From a young age, I was really exposed to photography through my father, and he was a physician, and he would occasionally work overseas and work in orphanages and places and come back with photographs he had made and show them to our community and raise awareness about these places. And, oftentimes he would combine these presentations with music, and they were very touching. And, I remember on multiple occasions crying really as a kid watching these things. And he would have slideshows in our living room for the family. And it would just, I learned from a very young age the power of still photography, and, in particular, the power of generating empathy regarding our humanity, not just, overseas with other people, but also within the family and friends. And so photography was always a hobby for me growing up. And it was in college, I guess, I had this mythology class, and at the same time I was in an art history class and photography class, and it really began to make sense how photographs can really not just move people, but really provide really crucial for storytelling in general, and for people to connect with the world and understand the world. And and it just really, really began to click. History, paintings, and media and journalism. And so it's something I always knew how to do since I was a kid. So I just sort of, coming out of school, I just began working at newspapers, went to grad school, and, later began working at magazines, and it feels very, I feel like I'm doing what I'm here to do. And in the past, 4 or 5 years or something, it's really changed with COVID, and we have a 3.5-year-old daughter, and the media landscape has also shifted a bit. So my priorities have kind of changed, and actually I'm working on building a storytelling company with a few friends. So it's kind of exciting, applying what I've learned over all these years to something where that can be very helpful for future storytellers.
Yeah. There's a lot of depth I think in a lot of industries, but especially in the one that you're in. And I will fully admit that when I was prepping for this and kind of, we were working through the phases of getting you on the podcast and whatnot, I had this idea of, oh my God, that'd be so fun. That'd be a cool job. And I had this cool, fun kind of perspective. And then I started looking at the work you were doing. I watched the episode on the HBO Special Witness. I watched that. And just this idea, this romanticized, oh, that'd be cool, that'd be fun kind of concept that I had in my head evaporated immediately. And I'm like, oh my God, this is crazy stuff, and it's heavy, and it's deep, and it's like, I don't know if fun's the word. I'm not saying you don't enjoy your career. I just don't know if this could be classified as fun anymore. So tell me if I'm on point on that. Is that kind of what you get from people when they talk to you? Because it's like, although I think you've got a really cool career, it's really interesting. I don't know if fun's the word I would associate to it.
Yeah, certainly parts of it have really been a lot of fun, all depending on what I'm photographing where I am. If it's like a travel assignment in Hawaii or something, then it can be very, it can be amazing, to get paid for that and be there and to, enjoy it. And, but then at the end of the day, I've always worked as a contractor, which is really how most
Yeah.
photographers like me work. We work on contract unless you work for like a newspaper. You're sort of, that is the life of a magazine photographer. And so at the end of the day, I always have a choice anyway, whether I want to photograph something or be in some place. And so many of the projects I've worked on have been because of my own interest and curiosity and what's happening with the people. And generally this means that it's like a place that is somehow undergoing some kind of transition, like major socio-political, it can be conflict, but it's usually somehow connected into my personal life. So like one of the most recent projects I was working on was in Israel on the West Bank, and my reasons for going there were related to the fact that my partner at the time was half Jewish, and I was around conversations in LA where her Jewish friends would be talking about what's happening over there, and Trump was making moves in the Golan Heights, and there was a lot of information in the media, and it was hard to know what was true and what was not true. And so I just wanted to go there and see it for myself, and so I could try and understand the place for myself. And while I'm in these places, I do assignments. Sometimes I get the assignment before I go, but a lot of times I try and stay after. And many of these places I've ended up like staying for months or years, or coming back over time. So I like to like spend a lot of time in a place and really get under under the covers of what's happening. And yeah, and so I can understand it more. But it's gotten me into situations where I've been in some pretty heavy conflict situations, to mostly because it felt necessary at the time, and I wanted to see and understand what I was seeing in the media and the news, and also just my own curiosity, wanting to understand like what something like conflict looks like, or what Cuba is like in the middle of the night with a group of youth, or what China is like while it's, undergoing this massive amount of construction. And so, yeah, the reasons have always been sort of more or less the same in some ways, which is the society is undergoing a massive shift. And so, yeah, I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. No, I would assume that when you immerse yourself in a culture like that too, you in some ways get swept up and kind of start to feel something for that culture. Has that happened to you? And does that change your perspective on it? Because I know you're going there on assignment, you're going there to, from a journalistic standpoint, to record, visually things. But when you're there long enough, you meet the right people, you experience enough things. I would imagine that impact, that change in perspective has got to do something to you.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one thing it does is that you sort of, when you begin meeting more people and learning about their story and understanding what's happening in their society, that you begin to feel more connected. You find more connections with them than you do you see the connections more than the differences. You see the similarities more than the differences. And that's a very powerful force. And it also has really drawn, it's kind of what keeps me there, especially in places where there's a big part of the population that is where there's a lot of underdogs, is like where, the disparity between wealth, privilege, and I think part of that is like, again, going all the way back into when I was a kid and my dad would come back and show these images. It was just a lot of times he's showing photographs of situations of, these people where they don't have much, and they're sort of relying on these physicians coming overseas and, operating on them for free because they can't afford to pay anything. And so, it's this empathy, and this compassion for people. And yeah, and it also makes situations really become more complex the more time you spend. And, because they become more dimensional, you learn more about a place, and that expands your perspective of what it is versus just never going to, say, the West Bank and just like reading the New York Times every day. I will have a certain perspective of the place. But if I go there and I can like see what I've read in the Times, but also see everything else, which is 99% that is not in the New York Times. Like, and I'm just using the Times as an example. I'm not like saying it's, the bad boy of media or anything, but just like media can only do so much. Of course, it's not real life. So it's just, which is also one of the challenges of being there as a photographer, is like how to condense all this and how to connect the world with your ideas and your perspective. And that never really gets easier, but it becomes more enjoyable, right? Like, the more into photography you get, the more into storytelling, the more that you understand storytelling, and it becomes more of an unconscious process. Yeah, the flow starts feeling a lot better, and you sort of feel like, okay, I can do this and this makes sense. And if you do it effectively, it's something that's very powerful, of course.
So I'm sure each one of these projects, for any listener, go out and look at Michael's Instagram or his website. You'll see just phenomenal worldly type photography. But I'm sure every one of these experiences, these assignments add up to kind of change and evolve who you are as a person. So what's the one that just like, that was the one that really made me look at things differently? Because I'm assuming it's Libya, but what's the one that really kind of changed it for you? There's got to be one that must stand out.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. Yeah, I think you're right. I think in every, career, there's like a moment that comes, sort of a climax where there's a shift that happens. Yeah, and for me, it was Libya for sure. There was a mortar attack that I was part of, and there were a couple friends and colleagues of mine in front of me who were killed, along with a bunch of other. They were like, I can't remember how many people were there at the scene, maybe 15 or 20, and I don't know exactly how many more were killed, but there were a lot of injured, including myself, and I lost like half the blood in my body and had, half a dozen pieces of shrapnel in my body, and, passed out, and like there's a lot that happened on that day, and it really shifted my view of photography and my place in this world, and made me appreciate things more, but also appreciate my sort of instinct and respect that instinct more. Because even though I was covering quite a bit of conflict at that time, on that day in particular, that afternoon, my instinct was pretty like hesitant, though I still went. So I didn't really trust my instinct. And I went because I didn't want to miss photographs that I thought really could be effective photographs for the war and for the project I was working on. And so there was like, I risked my life. And so I could, for the chance at photographing, for photography, which I've actually done like a number of times, but on that day in particular, because I was hit and because friends were killed and other people were there and I was there, something really shifted. And ever since then, I have not really taken as heavy as a risk. It's like I've been in like a number of conflict zones since then, but I've never really placed myself in the same kind of precarious situation. The other thing about that is that I was with Libyans who, the fighters who were the rebels at that time, most of them were not professionally trained. So it was like a bunch of, former mechanics or school teachers or carpenters who were walking around with guns. So it's, it's not like when you're covering the war with the American military or a professional military, you can be sure that they're taking every precaution. And so they can keep you safe, et cetera, like as much as they can. And they just, have a battlefield awareness from experience, and training and everything. And when you go in with rebel armies, a lot of times, I mean, of course, there's all different kinds of rebel armies, but yeah, it was just like sort of risk upon risk, like it's kind of like, I've been dealing like a lot in the NFT space and the crypto space. So when you think of something like cryptocurrency as like a speculative asset, in a lot of people's minds, and then when you look at it, the NFT trading is looked at as speculation on top of speculation. So it's like you're just increasing your risk like 100 times or 1,000 times or whatever. And that's how I feel like when you embed with rebel armies. So there was like a period of time where I was just, really hesitant to really go back into the war. But I did, like a few months later, after having a break, coming home, I went back because I felt like it's, I wanted to not cover the front lines in the same way, but see what would happen in country, because I felt really a part of what was going on, which again, it kind of, gets back into what I mentioned before. I'm not Libyan, but I'm human. And these things are all, these conflicts are all like interconnected, and they're global, and so I really, I began to feel like, being there and reporting and sharing my version of what was happening was important, and also just for myself, wanting to see the end of it. So, but yeah, I really took a lot from that experience. And I think it's, it's one of those things where I think maybe I would still be covering war in the same way now if I wouldn't have been stung in that way. It's like, like a beehive, you can go. I was around a beehive a few weeks ago, actually, with a friend, and I was kind of getting close and like sitting there in the middle of the day in the hot sun and just like watching the bees come in and out. And like my friend's like, dude, I'm not going that close. I'm like, why? He's like, because I've been stung like in a really bad way before. And even though he, probably will, the bees were not going to attack him, like you just never know. Right. So, but you don't really know until you've been stung really bad. And yeah, there were a lot of other things that happened that year too in Libya, kidnapping and multiple ambushes. And, I was injured on like another occasion too. So it was a really big year, and much of it, the effects of that year, I really didn't see for like 5 or 6 years after is really when it started to hit, which is a really common thing, I think, with conflict reporting. It's just like you sort of, the worst injuries happen after, right? It's like when you come home and, as we see with like a lot of our vets, right? With a lot of the stuff they deal with after they get back. I mean, I can't imagine. Well, I can kind of imagine, but yeah.
See, you'd mentioned, having empathy for these different places, these people, whatnot, but I would imagine there's just a crazy amount of compassion for them too, because like even watching, the HBO special, or even having seen stuff like this before, it really hits home that, some of our problems are just not problems, because you see what some of these people are going through. Like you said, you have school teachers, carpenters, plumbers, whatever, that are having to pick up a gun and defend themselves. It's like, man, like I really do have it pretty good.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Life is all perspective, right? It's like 100%, any situation we find ourselves in, anything that's happening that is weighing us down, or that is hard, or that is, we just have to like stop, close the eyes, have a breath, and like really think about all the people in the world who like, who don't even have access into clean water, or who have to walk, for hours every day. And so they can get clean water and come back. Like when I was living in Congo and Goma, like in the eastern part of the country at that time, that was in 2012 when I moved there, and I was living there off and on for, a few years. I still go back there every year, but there at that time, there were still plenty of people who were literally walking miles each way every day. And so they could get water from the lake that they could use for drinking and cooking. And that really gives a lot of perspective when you think it's like, most of us in the US, we just have to walk into the next room and the faucet comes on, and we can spend our time like, complaining about everything else that's wrong with our lives. But yeah, that's very true.
What's the most beautiful place, most welcoming place you've ever been or photographed? I asked that question just because obviously you're a photographer, you're an artist, whatnot, but you make some very what most people would think, these are not beautiful places. You do not want to be in these places. Through that camera lens and through your artistic eye, you make them look beautiful. So I'm just curious if you're going to say one of those places or if it's literally, like you said, Congo or someplace where it's more natural or whatnot. Cause it's just fascinating to me. And I like photography and I look at a lot of that stuff, but
Hmm.
when you see some of those photos, I mean, just obviously the lighting, it's just they're beautiful, but it's a guy holding a gun that in that moment was probably defending himself or defending his home or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Photography can be very tricky because much of the time people, they don't want to be voiceless, but they want to be faceless, depending on what it is, right? If I'm in like Sicily, as I was last year in the fall, photographing in the beautiful hill towns, people don't mind being in the picture because they know that you're there because it's a beautiful place and you're a tourist. And versus being in, yeah, like, well, even being, the image you mentioned, that could be, a kid or a young soldier who's very proud of his gun and very proud of being there. And that could also be easy to photograph. So there's like the beautiful place and the beautiful situation. And then there's the reception from the people, which they can both be there at the same time, or they can be there like sort of really independently, all depending on the situation. I could say like in the past few years, I made like 7 or 8 trips into Israel and the West Bank, and I was always greeted like so well when I was in Israel and in the West Bank. I mean, I remember being in these little towns in the West Bank where, they seem like they don't really have much. And then you go to like a wedding and it's just this really amazing event where everybody is like super happy and generous and they want you to be there. And it's, they're so welcoming. And yet, you see they don't really have much, like, in the place itself may not be very beautiful. And then kind of in the opposite, there's when I was in Hawaii a few months ago, I was in this place that was very beautiful, but the locals, clearly did not want me there. So it just kind of depends, right? It's like you can kind of be, can kind of be both, or they can exist kind of independently in the most unexpected situations. But I can say like one of the as far as like, having incredible like experience on both sides, I would say just like when I'm in Europe, like specifically when I'm in Spain, or when I'm in Italy, just cruising around, traveling around, being on vacation, whatever, photographing, I always have an incredible experience. Just, and again, I think it's because, one, it's a beautiful place and the locals are used to people coming there and taking pictures, and it makes for like a very pleasurable experience. But
Yeah.
there's a lot of things that don't
Circumstances
like that.
matter, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And
Yeah.
also, what really makes a huge difference is the way that you approach it as a photographer, as a human, right? Like, I think at the end of the day, if you approach it as just a nice person holding a camera, you're going to have way more success than if you approach it as like, a photographer who wants a great photograph. Like, for me, photography always comes second. What comes first is like, the human or humans I want to photograph. Like that is most important, of course. So my aims and my curiosity is also, important, but it's less important because I'm in these places photographing other people, and so a lot of it is the way that I speak, the way that I move. I mean, like, we can tell, of course, so much about other people by just those two things. And so, yeah, it's kind of like a dance as well, too, where people, I make sure that people like see me, for who I am. And like, because, a lot of times I'm asking to spend like, a lot of time around people photographing things that may not always be comfortable. So,
Well, Mike, I appreciate the time. This is really interesting. And again, I can't thank you enough for just kind of sharing some of it with me. I know it's interesting because it's heavy stuff. Like I was, I didn't look at this interview or this episode as like, hey, I'm talking to a photographer. I mean, I looked at it more as I was talking to somebody who's creating a lot of impact in the world and understands relationships and understands, just kind of how diverse things are. And your job is to capture it. And I think you do an amazing job at it, obviously. And I really appreciate you just sharing some of those insights with me.
Sure thing. Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
If you'd like to learn more about CyberDogs, share your thoughts, or even ask a specific question about this episode and or the brand Retro Mindset, contact me directly at mike@cyberdogsmarketing.com.